Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show has been running for over 6 years now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Every once in a while, I break my self-imposed format and talk with someone I just really want to, and I guess this is one of those episodes. James Fox wears a couple of hats. He's Director of Studies in History of Art at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and Creative Director of the Hugo Burge Foundation, more of which later. As well as that, he's a BAFTA-nominated broadcaster and an author with a new book out. Craftland is his journey through Britain to discover the craftspeople that literally make this island. En route, he meets dry stone wallers, a rush weaver, a thatcher, a letter cutter, and a watchmaker, to name just a few. The book illustrates what we once had and what we could be in danger of losing, while also highlighting the importance of hand skill and materiality in a digital age, all of which seems pretty relevant to this podcast. James, how are you? Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, Grant, thank you for breaking your rule and letting me on your podcast. I'm delighted to be here.
That's a pleasure. Was that reasonably accurate?
I thought that was pretty accurate. Yeah, I mean, I always find these introductions very, very embarrassing. So I sort of cringe as they're being said, but that was absolutely accurate. So thank you.
You didn't cringe visibly. So that's a good thing. Congratulations on the new book, on Craftland. Tell me a little bit about the thinking behind it. Why this book? Why now?
Well, I think, Grant, it's no secret that we are living through an industrial revolution right now, which is already changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we make, even the way we think, actually. And so it seemed to me like a really good time to look back at older ways of working and older ways of making, partly to document them before they potentially disappear, and partly to see what we could learn from them. So the book I conceived, 3 or 4 years ago. I spent about 1.5 years, 2 years traveling around the UK. It was one of the most wonderful experiences of my professional career. And then I spent about a year sitting at the kitchen table trying to write it, which was one of the worst professional experiences of my career. But it's out, came out on the 4th of September. And it's lovely now to be able to talk to people about the work that I've done and the people I've met.
That's quite interesting. I mean, I do ask this of writers, partly because of my own experience of trying to write a book and finding it really quite difficult and isolating. I mean, do you enjoy the writing experience?
Absolutely hate it, Grant. I have a passage at the very end of the book in the acknowledgements where I say that writing is manual labor. You know, it is a craft in its own right. And for me, it very much, when I went up onto the hills and I saw some dry stone wallers building this wall, I thought that's exactly how I feel. I've got these words, I'm trying to get them in the right order. Nothing's quite fitting. I find it physically as well as mentally very demanding. I feel so physically exhausted at the end of a day of writing. For me, the challenge is not so much the ideas. The ideas are all swirling around in the head. I've got loads of ideas. The challenge is to find the clearest, most compelling possible way of expressing those ideas. So for me, yeah, it's a real challenge. I struggle to get more than 500 words a day. That's typically my target. I very rarely meet that target. So, yeah, although if you looked at me through the window at the kitchen table, probably in my underpants, tapping away at a MacBook.
It's an image.
It's an image. I like to paint an image for your listeners. You might think, well, he's not working very hard, but it feels in many ways like, as I say, like manual labor. You are struggling and striving and sweating over the keyboard. You know, there was an author called Thomas Mann, famous writer. He was once asked, what is a writer? And he said, a writer is someone who finds it harder than most people to write. And I really empathize with that.
And are you very disciplined? Do you do a kind of 9 to 5 when you're doing something like this?
Before I had children, Grant, very disciplined. I would go to writers' retreats. My in-laws' garden shed was my favored location. And I would write 10, 12 hours a day. Now I drop off the children at 9 o'clock. I work until about 3. And typically I have to try to get my writing done by then, because after that, all rules are off.
So how old are your kids?
My children are 6, who's soon to turn 7, and 4.
You're at that stage.
Yeah, it's not compatible. Having young boys in particular, not particularly compatible with the writer's life. So you have to work in the time that you have.
I can see that. I mean, it is interesting because a number of the crafts you write about are under severe pressure. But there seems to be a really strong seam of writing about making. We've had authors such as Rob Penn, who wrote about creating his perfect bike and about making lots of products out of a single ash tree on the podcast. Glenn Adamson was one of the first guests we've ever had on in a slightly different vein, I guess. Tim Minchell has also been on the show talking about the importance of manufacturing. Are you feeling like you're part of a literary movement, I wonder?
Well, it's the first time I've ever been anything close to a zeitgeist. I'm delighted. I do feel that in the last couple of years, there has been an explosion in writing about specific crafts, where craftspeople themselves are writing memoirs about their work. I know you had Callum Robinson on the podcast recently.
Edmund Duval, obviously, as well.
And Edmund Duval. And so we're seeing a lot of that over the last couple of years. And it's absolutely wonderful to see. And most of those books are doing well because there is a growing interest in it. And I would say that one of the things I've experienced over the last few years is that though we talk about crafts being lost and endangered, we're also in some ways living through a craft revival right now. And that, I think, has been growing since certainly that first lockdown, when many, many people who were feeling alienated and anxious turned to making things with their hands as hobbyists primarily. And I think that's growing all the time. More and more people are taking up quilting classes and green woodworking classes all the time. And so I think there is a demand out there, and these books are satisfying that demand for people who are living in this increasingly digital virtual world to ground themselves in material things, in working with one's hands.
The book is dedicated to Hugo Burge, and you're the creative director of the Hugo Burge Foundation. So who is Hugo, and what does the foundation do?
Hugo was an extraordinary man. He was, first of all, an entrepreneur. He had made his money through his investments in mostly tech and online commercial enterprises. But he was also an art lover at heart. And he had always loved the arts and the crafts and furniture in particular. And he purchased this enormous stately home in the Scottish borders some years ago, and very quickly decided that he was going to turn it into a what he called a home for makers and creators.
This is Marchmont, right?
This is Marchmont House up in the Scottish borders. And so he renovated this house absolutely extraordinarily. He filled it with amazing works of modern and contemporary art, as well as traditional art. And he started turning the stable block and some of the outhouses into studios for artists and craftspeople. And perhaps his greatest achievement in this regard was what's now called the Marchmont Workshop. So Hugo was very interested in arts and crafts furniture, these rush-seated chairs that went back all the way to Ernest Jimson. And there was one guy left, basically, in the country, still in the Cotswolds, who was still making these traditional chairs. And he was approaching retirement, and he didn't have an apprentice. And Hugo was desperate for this tradition to continue. So he paid for 2 apprentices to train under this master craftsman. He purchased his tools when he approached retirement and built a workshop, or developed a workshop specially for these guys. And now they have this extraordinarily successful workshop up in the Scottish borders where they make these traditional arts and crafts furniture, chairs and benches and tables and stools, and they are doing extraordinary work. And so that is just one example. The Hugo Burge Foundation, which was named after Hugo's death a couple of years ago, has all kinds of workshops. So we've got a pottery studio, we've got a state-of-the-art silversmithing workshop, we've got the chair-making workshop, which I've mentioned, we've got hand engravers, we've got weavers, we've got illustrators, we're building new sites and developing new sites around the Scottish borders and beyond. So it's a really, really exciting and pretty new arts and crafts charity that is, spreading its wings right now. And we're hoping will have a really significant impact on the cultural scene across the UK.
So your role as creative director, James, is what?
So I am, yes, as you say, creative director of the foundation. I oversee all of the I suppose, the creative aspects of the foundation. So developing new projects, overseeing the artistic direction of the foundation, working with artists, working with craftspeople, working with other organizations to build partnerships in order to make sure that the foundation is doing the most exciting work imaginatively and the most socially meaningful work. So I'm based down in London, but I travel up to the borders every other week, where I'm there for a few days, meeting the various artists and craftspeople. And we're in the process now of developing some really exciting new projects that I'm not allowed to tell you about, I'm afraid, Grant. It's a bit too early. Okay. But hopefully next year you will be able to see some really exciting new initiatives that I'm working on right now.
Okay, we'll wait for next year on that. I mean, it'd be good to get back to the book, because in the first instance, it would be good to talk about the word craft. You describe it in your introduction as a slippery concept. As a former design journalist, my experience of it is that 20 or so years ago, it was a word that people just didn't use. It had negative connotations of amateurism and a village state aesthetic. When I left the architecture press to edit Crafts magazine, a number of my former colleagues made it clear that they definitely thought it was a step in the wrong direction. And then, to my mind, and you've kind of alluded to this earlier, it's undergone quite a renaissance in recent times, to the point of being overused and arguably abused by car brands and coffee houses and crisp companies in their marketing and PR. But what I thought was interesting about the book, and evidently from your experience, it remains a contentious word, and I wonder why.
It does. I think like the word art, some of the most important words to us are the most problematic. And art is a word that people have debated and argued over for so many years. Craft is exactly the same, because craft can mean different things to different people. You're completely right. You know, of the people I met, some people felt the word craft was a badge of honor. It was a word that described something that had been well made. And that's, as you say, why so many brands are taking on that term. And just as they're using the word artisan to try and express the kind of quality of their workmanship. Whereas other craftspeople, I'm calling them craftspeople, probably shouldn't, did not like that word at all, because for them, the associations were with amateur activities, hobbyism. There's a particular moment at the end, towards the end of one of the chapters, when I'm with a wheelwright. Greg Rowland, a remarkable wheelwright, whose family have been wheelwrights since the 14th century, he is just completing this extraordinary act where one of the most difficult things a wheelwright can do is to bond the wheels. You've made the wooden wheels, and then you have to put this metal tire on them. This is the most kind of explosive, brutal ballet of an act where, you know, he's surrounded by smoke and there's sledgehammers flying and there are flames everywhere. And he just finishes doing this extraordinary bonding of the wheel when an amateur cyclist, a tourist, who people from Devon call grockles, a tourist disembarks gets down off his rented bicycle and says to him, "Oh, you're a wheelwright, well done, keeping the craft alive." And it was so patronizing. And Roland was furious and he stormed off to his workshop. And that's when he said to me, "Look, I am not a craftsman, I am a tradesperson." And I think that's actually something that is a really important distinction that I try to bring out through the course of the book, is that it's really important to make the distinction between amateur craftspeople, and don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic thing to do, to spend your time working with your hands as a hobby, and those who actually have to make a living from it. And so that's a really important distinction that often craft blurs. And I think there are also other distinctions that word craft contains. And some people think of craft as a traditional practice. You have to be working with wood or working with stone. Whereas there are other people, and I would probably count myself in this camp, who think that actually craft can be very modern as well. There is a craft to doing lots of different professions, even in fact, if you're working digitally, if you're working with Adobe Photoshop.
This is what Richard Sennett really started in The Craftsman, however many, 15 or so years ago in that book. Yeah.
Yeah, I subscribe to that. I think there is a craft to all kinds of trades. And I think if we limit it to traditional things, then we risk the word essentially being a museum piece And I think we actually have to embrace that term to describe any kind of meaningful work in which you are, I suppose, thinking with your hands and striving for excellence for its own sake.
Yes, I mean, Sennett put it as doing a job for the sake of doing it well, I think was his definition. Before the Industrial Revolution, everything was craft. So in that sense, craft has defined itself against something.
Well, that's Glenn Adamson's argument.
Glenn's big on that, yeah.
Glenn's argument, and I think it's an interesting argument, is that craft is a modern invention. Just as art is a modern invention, you need to have something that emerges that you can define it against. But do you know something? I didn't want to, when I was writing this book, I thought, I've taught history of art and aesthetics for many, many years. And I thought, do I really want to fall into the semantic trap of spending pages and pages trying to define craft? Or do I just want to show rather than tell and show people making things well? And that was essentially my way of answering that question.
I mean, there is an interesting moment, I thought. I mean, you talk about the wheelwright. There's a chapter on thatching in the Scottish Highlands. And you write that at one time, and I'm kind of intrigued by this, thatching wasn't considered a trade or even a craft, but an essential civic duty. How so?
Well, because, of course, for many, many generations, you wouldn't have had in these very small Scottish townships, these tiny little communities, they wouldn't have been big enough to sustain a professional thatching operation. So everyone would do it together. So that was the way it was done. If a house needed to, or a black house or a cottage needed to be rethatched, everyone in this small community would head out to the woods or to the coast, and they would, harvest the material. If they were living up in the forest, they would often get heather. If they were on the coast, they might use seaweed or marram grass. They would all collect it together, singing songs as they went, because the songs were used to sort of, if you like, help them navigate those routines and the monotony of the work at times. And then they would bring it back, and as quickly as possible, they would thatch that house together, all of them together, because you had to do it quickly. When you've got weather like you have up in the Scottish Highlands, you had to do it quickly. So this was a community enterprise, and they would not have had the term craft. They would just be roofing someone's house. So in that sense, it does, I suppose, support Glenn Adamson's theories that, you need to have a kind of particular intellectual set of discourses to have the term craft.
Yes, interesting. I mean, again, in your introduction, you write that at its best, craft embodies a particular approach to life and work, a way of being in the world that has arguably never been more valuable. Can we try and define what that approach is?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, Grant, we are living in this increasingly digital world when people feel increasingly disembodied from their physical existence, from the materials around them, from their communities. And craft has this ability to connect us to material things, to connect us to using our hands to do something that isn't just scrolling through our phones, to think about the materials that are around us, the landscapes that are around us, and to put something physically into the world that you can use in a practical way on a daily basis. So for me, I think it's a great antidote to the ether that many of us increasingly feel ourselves living in.
In that sense, it's being defined once again, in your terms, against a different industrial revolution.
I think it is, absolutely. I mean, I think that, don't get me wrong, I don't see there being a contradiction necessarily between new technology and craft. I think craft is a living tradition. It's a vital tradition. Craftspeople have often used and indeed created new technologies. I think what we're seeing, for instance, is social media playing an enormously important role in bringing craftspeople great opportunities they didn't have before. If you were, for instance, a basket weaver in North Wales 20 years ago, how would you reach your audience? How would you reach your market? Very, very difficult. But now, obviously, a basket weaver in North Wales is able to reach an audience of potentially millions around the world. So I don't see necessarily a contradiction between technology or even social media and the crafts, but I feel that it can provide a certain kind of embodied experience that lots of our digital lives, aspects of our digital lives are not.
I mean, you conclude that part of the book, your introduction, by posing a number of questions. Can materiality survive in an increasingly virtual world? Can local traditions coexist with globalizations? what does meaningful work look like in an age dominated by so-called bullshit jobs? And in some regards, it's that third question that I'm most interested in. In your view, having done this, what does meaningful work look like? And are most people's jobs bullshit?
I don't think most people's jobs are bullshit. I think this is that famous book by Steve Graeber, I think it was, who spoke about bullshit jobs, where more and more people are part of major organizations and their jobs get reduced and reduced and reduced. So they're not seeing the full cycle of production to consumption going on in a nature of job. I don't believe that at all. But I believe that we obviously have made a transition over the last 40 years or so from being a primarily manufacturing economy to a primarily service-based economy, maybe more than 40 years. So manufacturing occupies only 10% of the UK's economy, whereas, a couple of hundred years ago, we were the largest manufacturer in the world. In fact, we were we were producing 43% of the world's manufactured exports. And I think that transition from manufacturing to services is a very significant shift, not just in the economy, but in the way people think about their work and the way people think about their purpose in life as well. So I think that's part of the larger context. There's also, of course, a new context. We talk about this new industrial revolution where lots of jobs are going to be changed and lots of jobs are going to disappear as a result of AI, which is again leading people to think again about, what is a meaningful, sustainable job. So I think that there's a list I have at the end of the book with the extinct job titles, which you may have noticed. These wonderful names of jobs that went out of existence about a century ago or so. These terrific names like bumboat women and quarrel pickers and bottom stainers and catgut makers. We laugh at these job titles, but what would people think about someone today called a brand ambassador or, me, a creative director, or an influencer? These are, I think that we have to constantly be reappraising, both as a society and as individuals, what is meaningful work to us. And there is no one answer to that. I don't think craft is right for everybody. I don't think we can build an entire economy on craft. But I think there is lots of evidence that for individuals who want it either as to pivot to do it as professional work or to have it as something in their spare time, that it's extremely rewarding and can have enormous personal and social benefits to be able to work with one's hands.
Hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just to let you know, the programme for the first ever Assemble with Material Matters conference has been announced. The event, which takes place on the 20th of November at the Bank of England Conference Centre, promises to be a lively mix of keynote lectures and panel discussions. Panellists to look out for include Hannah Tash, founder of denim company Black Horse Lane Studio, Sarah Grady, co-founder of British Pasture Leather, Rowan Moore, architecture critic of The Observer, editor-in-chief of Car Design News, James McLachlan, radical developer Jonathan Smales, UAL's Professor Rebecca Early, and AHMM's Paul Monaghan, to name just a few. Meanwhile, keynotes come from materials guru Caroline Till, academic, author and manufacturing expert Professor Tim Minchell, Peter Apps, journalist and writer of the extraordinary book on the Grenfell Tower fire, Show Me the Bodies. Finally, the ever-excellent Glenn Adamson will be closing proceedings. Not only that, but there'll be plenty of opportunities for networking, not least in the evening at the Bank of England Museum, when the likes of Alkash Palmer, Rootful, Sanib Visser, Lulu Harrison and Solid Wool will be displaying work. So if you love the pod, you'll have a blast at Assemble. You can see the full programme on our website. Tickets for Assemble with Material Matters cost £175 plus VAT, and they're available until the 6th of November. To purchase, go to the link I've added in the show notes or check out materialmatters.design. That's materialmatters.design. And hurry, because they're selling fast. Can we talk about your own interest in the subject, James? Because as you've alluded to, you come from a fine art background, and traditionally there has been a bit of a divide between fine art and craft. So in the first instance, when did you discover your passion for art? I think they were right in saying there was a Damascene moment at the age of 8 at the Stanley Spencer Gallery in Cookham, right? What happened?
Yes, I was... When I was a boy, I was not interested in art at all. I was interested in football stickers and superheroes, as most boys are.
Quite right too.
And my father was deeply disapproving of this. He was an art lover. And so he used to take my brother, my sister and I to museums and galleries all over the country. And it was always a disaster. We'd always hate it. We'd always complain. Anyway, one day, it was 1990, so I was 8 years old at the time. It was the Italia 90 World Cup. Grant, you probably remember. I was collecting my football stickers, my Panini football stickers. And he forced me to go to this trip to the Stanley Spencer Gallery, which was in Cookham, just outside of London. And I saw this painting there that completely changed my life. It was this remarkable, very odd painting of a scarecrow, broken scarecrow in a field. And I found this painting so unbelievably moving that I actually started weeping in front of the picture. And that was really the beginning for me of realizing the value of art and people making things, and the beauty of that, and the expressive power of that. And so I became a very passionate and enthusiastic artist myself. In fact, behind me, you can see two of these paintings are my own. So I still paint and draw very regularly. And so for me, I've always been interested since that point in the people who make things. And it's why I became an art historian, because I wanted to study creative people. I've always found it thrilling. I've always found it awe-inspiring. But as you rightly say, Grant, art historians like me in the past created these completely phony distinctions between fine art and craft, where typically art was associated with geniuses who were typically white men, and craft was done by women and peasants and people who didn't deserve to be written about. That distinction has been obviously being broken down now for years, thankfully. And there are many great artists who consider themselves to be craftspeople, and there are many great craftspeople who we might consider to be artists. And so with this book, I think I wanted to be able to write about craftspeople in the same way as I had previously written about great painters and sculptors, and to treat them with the same reverence and to write about them in the same detail, because I think they're just as culturally significant as painters and sculptors and composers and actors, and they haven't really had the credit they deserve. Most of the people in this book, there are a few obviously very celebrated figures, but most of the people I've discussed in this book do not have the credit they deserve. They're mostly struggling to make ends meet. They're working in relative obscurity compared to some of the other creative figures in our country.
Well, I was going to ask you about that and how you went about choosing the various crafts and also which makers to focus on, because as you point out, they range from dry stone wallers, the nobles charging £85 to make a metre of dry stone wall, to the work of the watchmaker Roger Smith, charging more than £300,000 for one of his timepieces. And then towards the back end of the book, the instrument maker Moussa Dembele, who's probably sleeping in his workshop. So was it important to have that kind of economic range as well as materials and skills?
Absolutely. I thought very carefully, very long and hard about having as much diversity in this book as possible, because craft is inherently diverse. And so I was thinking about geographical diversity. I was thinking about having people from all across the country. So we have people in Northern Ireland and in the Scottish Highlands and in the Isle of Man and the Southeast and the Southwest and London and the cities and the countryside. I was thinking about diversity in terms of the materials they work with, whether it's rush or heather or stone or wood or metal. I was thinking about diversity of their status as craftspeople. So there are some people who I was looking at who, as you say, are working at a very sort of the lower end in terms of what they can charge. There's a spa maker in the Chilterns who gets about 85p for a hazel spa that is then sent to thatchers around England, all the way up to Roger Smith, who is selling his handmade watches for more than £300,000. And I think part of the purpose of that is to show that actually craft has many different pathways. It can be many different things. One of the feasible futures for craft is through the luxury market, and we have great designers, fashion designers, for instance, embracing craft and craftspeople. But it can also operate in a more low-key communal level as well. And I think that diversity is its strength.
Interesting. I mean, should the state be doing more to protect these skills, James? I mean, it has been noticeable in the past few years that quite a number of craftspeople have received MBEs, for instance. Is there more the state can be doing? I mean, going back to that Highland thatching chapter, it suggested that local councils and public institutions could commit to thatching bus shelters and information booths, for instance, at a time when the public purse is under so much pressure. Is that realistic?
I think there is a lot more that the state could do. I think that we are one of the worst countries in the developed world to be a craftsperson. I think if you compare us, for instance, to Japan and South Korea, if you were a top craftsperson in Japan or South Korea,
living national treasures, right?
You can be a living national treasure where the state actually pays you to promote and to pass on your craft and to keep that particular kind of living heritage alive. France has a similar scheme. And if you think, for instance, how quickly the French were able to rebuild Notre Dame, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why they were able to rebuild that so quickly is the state itself has invested for many years in building its body of craftspeople. If, Westminster Abbey, burnt down, God forbid, at some point in the future, it would take us decades and decades and decades to do that because the state simply hasn't invested in this body of makers and this demographic. So I think there's much more that we can do at a centralized level. I think really good work has been done by organizations to raise the profile of the crafts. I think the very fact that this book has been published and people are reading it, and that other books we've talked about at the start of this interview have reached audiences, is because there is a growing recognition of the value of the crafts to our society, to our sense of our past and our present and our future. I think one of the biggest problems, and it's probably something you've encountered through many of your interviews in the past, Grant, one of the biggest problems that craftspeople face is apprenticeships. It's really, really difficult. There's very little support from the government to get apprenticeships going. And if you're a sole trader or a small business runner, you don't literally have the time or the effort or the money to be able to commit to recruiting an apprentice who then may not even stay the course. So I think there's a lot more that the government can do, but I agree with you, Grant. We have to be realistic. There's very little money sloshing around in government at the moment. It seems unlikely that government is going to suddenly step forward with a really generous package to support the crafts.
It's not a vote winner, generally, at a general election.
It's not a vote winner, but we also have to recognise that the heritage crafts industry is 5 times the size, economically speaking, than the fishing industry. It is a much bigger sector than we think. And that the creative industries, which is the larger, I suppose, sector in which the crafts sit, is one of the fastest growing sectors of the UK economy and growing several times faster than the economy as a whole. So, there are opportunities there, but I think that the moment is probably not quite there for the government to lean into them right now.
No, I'm quite intrigued by your occasional mentions of craft's role in the transition to net zero. You reference woodsmen and woodswomen could have an important role to play, for example. How?
Well, I think that we are embarking on a very significant and overdue tree planting program. It's been going on for some years. I mean, successive governments, in fact, have committed to planting an area larger than the new forest in trees every single year in an attempt to increase tree cover in this country from historic lows 100 years ago to historic highs. And that is happening at the moment, slower than I think the government would like it to happen. But if you are going to start planting forests, growing forests, they need to be managed. And in order for them to be managed, we need woodland managers, coppice workers, woodland craftspeople to do that. So for me, I think this is a growth industry. It's not a massive growth industry, but it is an opportunity, for instance, where we can where people with specific sets of skills and hand skills as well can be used to manage what is going to be an increasingly important economic resource within the growing green economy.
We are the second biggest importer of wood in the world after China, which is a remarkable statistic. There are moments in the book, James, I hope you don't mind me saying, when you seem a bit fed up with the modern world. At one point, you write that Bedfordshire today is a monument to a modern economy grounded in the relentless circulation of goods, people and capital. And you talk about it being generated by artificial intelligence. It's kind of interesting because on occasion you sound wistful for an old England that was a little bit reminiscent of John Major's kind of warm beer and cricket sentiments when he was Prime Minister. And I mean, if you don't mind me saying, every now and again, there's a slight sense of a Farage view of what Britain should be like. But then you undercut it with your obvious interest in sustainability and how the crafts could contribute. Is the book apolitical in that sense?
The book is apolitical in every other way than the only sort of political thing about the book is the belief that making still matters and that creativity matters to individuals and to communities and to society as a whole. I'm not a traditionalist actually at all. I believe that, and I hope that I say something in the book, that in this book is nostalgic, it is nostalgic for the present. It is nostalgic.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important line in the book, which is to say that actually the book is a celebration of the here and the now. It's a celebration of what is happening now. It is a celebration of the diversity of this country. There is nothing, I would say, Farage-like about this book whatsoever. It's also a book that's about the extraordinary positivity that waves of migration for thousands of years have brought in terms of craft and trade and new skills and new ideas to this country. The book begins in chapter 1 with small boats crossing the channel and those Neolithic people bringing a whole new range of crafts, the first pottery, the first dry stone walls to this country. And it ends with the great diversity that is London and the skills that are still being brought here from around the world. I do not believe that craft is a hangover from the past. I don't believe that craft is some tradition that we need to just keep alive on life support. It is a living, vital tradition of people working with their hands, of creativity, of pushing things forward. And I think if crafts don't respond to the needs of modern society, of the here and the now, then they will fade away. And I think actually the craftspeople that I discuss in this book who are most successful are the ones who are moving with the times, embracing new technology where necessary, embracing a new sort of globalized economy and a globalized market, using social media cleverly, and making things that people want today. So this is not a traditionalist book at all.
No, it's interesting. I get the sense that you're a little critical of how we allowed some of our craft industries to wither. Why didn't the watchmakers of Clerkenwell keep up with the Swiss and the US, for example? Why did Sheffield get usurped when it came to making cutlery and other steel tools?
Well, exactly. The reason they didn't is because they didn't move with the times, because they didn't progress. It's not that that the world missed the great traditions. So what happened in the watchmaking in the UK? We were the leading watchmaking country in the world in 1800. We produced half of all of the world's watches in 1800. And then the Swiss came along and the Americans came along. And then the quartz revolution happened, and then the East Asian manufacturers came along, and they produced watches more efficiently, more cost-effectively, and British watchmakers refused to move with the times. They refused to experiment with modern techniques and modern ways of working and more efficient ways of managing their workforces. Exactly the same happened in the Sheffield steel and cutlery industry. And they got priced out of the market. So, this is, again, the point I would make is that, craft is like a shark. It needs to keep moving if it's to stay alive. And so I am in no way trying to advocate that we should go back to 200 years ago. It's also important to say that I try very hard not to romanticize the crafts. I am obviously in awe of the people I discuss in the book. But I don't want us to go back to the past, because these crafts obviously are very difficult jobs even now, but 200, 300 years ago, they were brutal, very, very difficult, underpaid, often exploitative jobs. So yeah, I don't look through misty eyes back in the past and think if only it could be like that. I just want to make sure that we recognize the value, the ongoing value of making and handmade things and well-made things in the modern world.
One of the things that comes out of the book, these extraordinary stories of some of the people you feature and how they ended up doing what they do. Felicity Irons, for example, renowned rush weaver, but her life might have taken a very different course, but for a car crash in Australia.
Yes, we often think that these traditional craftspeople are only craftspeople because it's been in their family for 46 generations or something like that. But a number of the people I discuss in Craftland have found their craft through accident, through chance. And Felicity Irons is one of those people. Felicity had no intention of becoming a craftsperson. She grew up in Bedfordshire, where I grew up. And she was traveling, hitchhiking through Australia when she was in her early 20s, when the car she was in suffered this terrible accident. It flipped over into the mud and she was very severely injured. She broke her back in multiple places and she eventually returned to England to convalesce. And her whole future path of her career was destroyed, really. She had originally wanted to become an actor. She had lost all of her confidence, wasn't able to even get through auditions. She was unable to even sit at a desk for a long period of time, so couldn't do the office work. And so she was thinking about what could she do, what kind of job could she do that she could do standing up and on the move for her injuries. And it was at that point that by chance she discovered this book on her mother's bookshelf about rush weaving. Now, rush weaving used to be an extremely commonplace craft. It was done all over the country. And the rush weavers made the seats and baskets and mats and carpets and everything. But by the early 1990s, when Felicity was in this situation, there were hardly any left. It was a really dying trade. And Felicity taught herself very slowly, very meticulously how to weave rush. And now, 25, 35 years later, she is one of the country's leading craftspeople. And she has a workshop in Bedfordshire that produces the most extraordinary array of goods. And she is a model for me of the modern craftsperson. She's someone who is very successful, very canny commercially. The quality of her work is fantastic. It's extremely sustainable work. And yet she's working with top brands, top hotels. She's doing work for Hollywood film productions. And that for me is an example. She's a perfect example of someone who can take something that is basically extinct and give it this new lease of life and make it feel modern and fresh and contemporary in the best possible way.
And then there's a story of the letter cutters, David and Leda Kindersley, which is a kind of craft love story or borderline stalking, whichever way you look at it, really. But it's an extraordinary, I mean, the way they met, I know their work. Had no idea of the background of their relationship.
Yeah, well, this is a letter cutting workshop in Cambridge. They're some of the finest letter cutters in the country.
Oh, genius, yeah.
If not the world. And this letter cutting workshop was quite famous even back in the 1970s. It had come down from Eric Gill, who himself was a great letter cutter. And Leda Kindersley, her name was Leda Cardozo at the time, was this Dutch fine art student, and she had heard about this extraordinary workshop in Cambridge and the man who ran it called David Kindersley, and she was desperate to meet him. He was her great hero, and so she sort of followed him across Europe to across the Iron Curtain to Warsaw and all over the place. He had no interest in her whatsoever. He was much older than her, but she was desperate to become an apprentice at his workshop. And eventually, through years and years of browbeating him, she managed to let him take him. He agreed to take her on as an apprentice. This is in the 1970s, and amazingly, they fell in love and they married and they had children. And then she took on the workshop from him, and she is still running that workshop in Cambridge 50 years later. And it is one of the great crafting workshops in the country. And of course, it would never have happened without this one young girl's dogged determination to find a teacher, to find a master. And then, of course, the unlikely love story that followed.
I mean, there are a number of elements that run through the book. One of them is the importance of tacit knowledge. Can you define what that is?
Well, perhaps by definition, it can't be defined. I think, tacit knowledge is something that a number of people, a number of the craftspeople I met spoke about. Some of them obviously didn't use that phrase because they wouldn't have known what that phrase meant, but they were expressing that phrase in the way they worked. And tacit knowledge is a kind of knowledge that cannot necessarily be explained to another person. It cannot be written down on paper. It cannot be learned from reading a book. It cannot be learned from at a university, but it somehow lives in the fingertips. It's somehow something that just resides in the body. It's a kind of muscle memory by which a craftsperson just knows whether this is the right movement to make, the right amount of material that's needed for a specific thing. And so it's great to watch that. And often I would watch these craftspeople at work and I would see them make a decision that seemed maybe counterintuitive, but it worked out perfectly. And then I would say afterwards, how did you decide to do it that way? And they wouldn't be able to explain it because it was just living in their bodies in that sense.
Another is time and slowness, that the objects these people produce are worth waiting for. I mean, Lida, who we talked about, the letter cutter, for example, has a set text about the importance of sharpening a pencil,
yes,
which I thought was utterly extraordinary.
I know. Well, there's a very strict rule in that workshop, and it's a workshop that's full of strict rules, in which that before you set to work, the first thing you have to do is you sharpen your pencil. And you cannot just take it to a pencil sharpener and do it in a few seconds. You have to take out a knife and you have to carve that pencil into the sharpest and longest possible point, because it takes time and it gets you prepared mentally for the work that you have to do. And I think this is something that I found in so many different crafts through the course of this book is the patience that is required in doing them. There's one chapter on bell founding. The patience required to be a bell founder is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the making of every bell takes a very, very long time, but the whole process of commissioning bells takes even longer. So I got one fact in the book that just before the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which was the second last bell foundry left in this country.
Yeah, which I did visit many years ago. It's an extraordinary place.
It's extraordinary. It was the longest running manufacturing business in the country.
Since 1470 something. Yeah, amazing.
And anyway, before it closed about 10, 15 years ago, they hung a series of bells for St. Albans Cathedral. And the process of getting those bells done is absolutely extraordinary. So they spent 43 years working on those bells. 43 years passed from the commissioning of those bells to the eventual installation. That is, I mean, a ludicrously long time scale. But generally speaking, I think all of the craftspeople that I spoke to have a sense of the time it takes to make something, whether it's 40 minutes to do one particular process, or it's several hours to do this, or it's several months between, to test out a watch, for instance, before it can be sold. Every craftsman is aware of their time because it's human time. It's not machine time. It's the amount of time that a human being has to dedicate in their lives towards completing a particular task. And that's really inspiring thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that runs through the book, like a seam or a thread, is the importance of tools. There's a quote from the cutlery maker John Adams who says, "You can learn everything about a society from its tools."
Yeah,
I'm guessing you agree with that.
I do agree with that, actually. And I think that every single craftsperson I spoke to was obsessed with their tools. In fact, I had a sort of slightly jokey line in the book that was cut out by my editor where I said every craftsperson is obsessed with their equipment. That was cut out. But it is true. They care very deeply about their tools. Many of them are very nostalgic for their tools. So many people are using old tools that were passed to them by their fathers or their grandfathers. And many of them say that it's partly as well that the steel was better back in the day. I'm not sure if that's actually true. Others have disagreed, but many of them feel that's the case. And I think that I think that for most of us who don't necessarily work with our hands, we don't think about tools in quite the same way. We buy cheap tools from the local B&Q or whatever it is, and those tools generally aren't very nice. They usually break pretty quickly, or they rust quickly, or the handles break, or they blunt, or whatever it is. But actually, even if you're just a layman like me, when you get hold of a really good pair of tools, it is really quite extraordinary. And so when I was up in Sheffield, I thought, you know what, I'm going to get myself a pair of handmade scissors. I'd spent my life using these cheap plastic scissors. So I bought myself a pair of handmade scissors from Ernest Wright, and it's night and day. It's night and day. I spend most of my time now walking around the house holding these scissors, looking for excuses, trying to find things to cut. And I do think that, well-made tools can actually improve the lives and the everyday lives, not just of the people who are who are professional tradespeople working with their hands, but even just ordinary people. If you invest in a really good pair of scissors or a fantastic kitchen knife, your life will be improved by that. Of course, we have to, these things are more expensive. We have to recognize it's one of the great dilemmas that craft has had to face for a long time.
Since William Morris, right?
Well, William Morris encountered this 150 years ago, that if you try and bring craft to the masses, it faces this inevitable problem that they are going to be more expensive than mass-produced goods. And so it won't be for the masses, it will be for a relatively wealthy elite. And that is a problem. But I also feel that, say, with a pair of scissors, you can buy a great pair of handmade scissors for £100. You could buy a cheap pair of scissors for £10. You'll probably go through 3 or 4 pairs of those scissors at least through the course of your life. You buy one pair. It makes sense economically in the long run.
Yeah. Thinking about threads that run through the book, one of the things I was really kind of intrigued by was a couple of your subjects. The motivation for doing the work that they do, this sense of duty. There's a crab pot maker, David French, for instance, that makes it clear that he's not in it for the money or the fame, and that he hates making sometimes. Instead, he feels the need to transmit his skills. And likewise, Dembele, the instrument maker, I mean, he described craft as being his fate, something he can't get out of. Were you expecting those responses when you asked them?
I wasn't actually expecting those, because often we do romanticize craft.
Yeah, we do.
We think, oh, they're going to absolutely love it. They're going to have a fantastic time. A lot of people have this myth about craft, which is that it's all relaxing and mindful, and it's the person in their lovely workshop making things. This is not the case for most professional craftspeople, I would say. And I'm sure you've encountered this as well. It's, as Felicity Irons said to me, it's bloody hard work. Because if you are a professional craftsperson, you're doing all the making, which is physically as well as mentally very demanding, but you've got to do all the other rubbish as well. You've got to do the invoices, you've got to do your social media account, you've got to pay your tax, you've got to try and drum up your clients and your business. Then you have moments of feast and famine. You've either got too much on and you're completely overwhelmed, or you don't have enough on, and so you're going to struggle to pay your bills. So you've got all of those challenges. And then I think there's the added challenge. If you are like David French or like Moussa Dembele, part of this very, very fragile tradition, and you feel very strongly and passionately about that tradition not dying out, then you have that burden of finding the next person to do it, passing the parcel, as Alan Bennett once wrote, to make sure that tradition doesn't die. And in Moussa Dembele's case, it's a kind of prison sentence. His family have been instrument makers and musicians for dozens of generations. He has no escape, as he puts it. He has to do that, whether he wants to or not. And when his father dies, he will have to leave London, where he's moved to 10 years ago or so, return to his village in West Africa and take up that duty. And so we have to be very careful, I think, about romanticizing craft and thinking about it as just a lovely thing to do. There are all kinds of competing tensions and pressures on craftspeople, as there are on all of us.
Yeah, but there is a lot of jeopardy in this book. In a number of these crafts, the bell foundry that you mentioned, for example, the Jewish calligraphy, if you make a mistake,
yes,
then you start again. And that process is long, right?
Yes, I mean, the most daunting one is if you're a Jewish sofer. Now, a Jewish sofer is is a sort of calligrapher. It's a scribe whose job is to write sacred religious texts and preserve sacred religious texts. So the most famous example is the great Torah scrolls that you have in synagogues. But even on smaller scale, you have the little mezuzah, which are the scrolls that are on the front door of most Jewish households. But this is a job that you really, if you make a mistake, you are screwed. Because if there's a mistake, you are dishonoring the word of God. And so if you try to cover it up with some Tipp-Ex or you try to pretend, you don't want to do that. You can't do that because it's on parchment, it's not on paper. Okay. But if you try to sort of pretend the error isn't there or hope someone doesn't notice, then you are essentially not only dishonoring God, you're lying to God. And so there is really no way out. So if you have spent 9 months working on a Torah scroll, and a Torah scroll typically takes at least a year to compose, if you're 9 months in and you make a mistake, you have to start again. You have to start again. You have to take that scroll, you have to bury it in a cemetery because you're not allowed to destroy it or burn it, and you have to begin again. And there are not many jobs, I would say nowadays, that are that exacting of their practitioners. You know, if I make many, many mistakes through the course of my book, I just press the delete button and I start again. No harm done. But if you are writing a Torah scroll, or if you are carving an inscription into a piece of stone that is, cost tens of thousands of pounds, or if you are casting a bell that your company has been developing for 43 years, there's not much margin for error. So that itself, there is a lot of jeopardy.
Yeah. There's also physical danger. I mean, you talk about the romanticizing of the crafts, but a number of the people seem to have got injured. We talked about John Adams earlier, who makes cutlery. He's lost 3 fingers. And you mentioned Ernest Wright, and there are stories of people losing their lives. Nick Wright of Ernest Wright, who became so overwhelmed by the task of trying to keep the company afloat, he committed suicide. So there is lots of optimism in this book, James, but there's also sorrow and a degree of melancholy too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are success stories and there are not success stories. I think the first thing I would say is that, like any physical work, there are dangers associated with the craft. And I encountered many people who were maimed in one way or another: loss of fingers, flattened hands, various scars, limps for things that have fallen on them. I think it's one of the problems that a lot of people face in terms of bringing in apprentices, is that the health and safety regulations make it very difficult in these little tightly cramped workshops where you've got very dangerous equipment constantly on the move to take on people in a safe environment. So I think there are serious problems. And certainly I think that my book is ultimately an optimistic book. It's ultimately a celebration of what survives. It's a celebration of the creativity and the diversity of making that still exists in this country. But I would be lying to say there aren't very sad stories of many companies that have gone under, many crafts that have disappeared. In the last 10 years alone, 5 traditional crafts have gone extinct. They're unlikely to come back. More and more crafts are becoming endangered and critically endangered all the time. But there are also crafts that are being revived, and they're crafts that are in really rude health at the moment. So it's a mixed picture.
Yeah. I mean, in your conclusion, you described Craftland as a place, which I think is kind of fascinating. I mean, ultimately, what would we be losing if these skills died away as a nation?
I think there are various things we'll be losing. I think the first thing we'd be losing is our past, because these skills are part of our heritage. When we talk about heritage, we often think about what's called tangible heritage. We think of the stately homes and the museums and the galleries and the monuments. And the UK is pretty good at looking after its tangible heritage. We have the National Trust, we have English Heritage, we have various bodies that look after that aspect of our past. But the other aspect of our past is what's often called intangible heritage. It's the skills, it's the practices, it's the traditions, it's the crafts and the songs and the oral histories that are also a part of our heritage. So we lose those things, and we lose part of ourselves. We lose part of this country's history. We lose part of what makes the regions different from each other. So we lose that sense of community identity. So that's the first thing we lose. The second thing we lose is a crucial part of our economy. Because as I say, the heritage craft sector and the craft sector and the creative industries sector is a massive part of our economy. That's a very flexible part of our economy that's growing very quickly. It's an area in the economy in which Britain genuinely does punch above its weight. And so I think that we also lose part, not just of our past, but of our economic future. So there are this is in our interest, whether we are traditionalists or liberals or progressives, whether we're looking forward or looking back. It's in our interest to try to keep these practices alive.
I mean, the book is broadly optimistic. Are you optimistic for the future of hand skills in this country?
I'm very optimistic. I am. There are crafts that will disappear in the years to come. Of course, there will be. I'm aware of the challenges that the crafts face. But I also feel, as I say, that we are going through this revival at the moment. I think there is a growing interest. There's growing recognition of the value of these practices. There's a growing interest among consumers to buy things that are sustainably made, that are well made. There's a growing interest in younger people to find these kinds of careers. So for me, yes, I do remain optimistic. I went into this book thinking, God, endangered this, extinct that, lost that, disappearing. That's going to be so depressing. Almost as soon as I started going out of the country, I was filled with optimism and inspiration for those who are still doing these things. And what is amazing is that most of these craftspeople, most of them aren't wealthy people, but most of them are busy. Most of them have more than enough business to keep them going. So for me, I am optimistic. Craft has to change. It has to move with the times. But that is happening all the time. And so, yeah, I feel pretty optimistic about the larger picture.
James, that's a lovely place to leave this interview. Congratulations on Craftland. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Craftland, a journey through Britain's lost arts and vanishing trades, is out now and is a delightful read. Rather than buying it from Jeff Bezos, why don't you purchase a copy from the dedicated Material Matters bookshop? You can find it on our website, materialmatters.design, plus I'll put a link in the show notes. You can also go to our website to hear other podcasts that I've done, to sign up to our newsletter, and to find out all about Assemble, our new conference at the Bank of England Conference Centre on the 20th of November, which will include many of your favourite guests from the show. Tickets are available until the 6th of November, and we'd love to see you there. It's going to be really good, if I say so myself. One more thing. It would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £3.50 a month, you can receive invites to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.